In the autumn of 1948, a glamorous stage actress climbed the stairs to her dressing room at the London Hippodrome and found a royal visitor waiting for her. The future Queen of England lay pregnant at home with her first child, and within weeks, Fleet Street would brand that evening a royal affair. For the rest of her life, the actress would beg the palace to clear her name, and for the rest of his life, the Duke of Edinburgh would refuse. Did Prince Philip betray the woman he married only a year before? Or did a hungry press invent a scandal out of a single night of dancing? And how does a man trailed by a personal detective every hour of every day conduct a string of secret love affairs? Long before the rumors, before the headlines and the whispered names of glamorous women, a young naval officer carved out a reputation for cool competence and a tongue sharp enough to wound. Royalty ran in his blood, yet stability never did. Philip of Greece and Denmark grew up stateless and frequently penniless, shuttled between relatives across Europe after political violence drove his family from their adopted homeland in the early 1920s. As an infant, he fled Greece in a fruit crate lined with blankets, smuggled aboard a British warship, while revolution swallowed the throne his uncle once occupied. By the time he reached the Royal Navy, he commanded respect through raw skill rather than royal birth, and his fellow officers remembered a man who craved argument and the open sea. His family scattered to the winds of the century's chaos. His mother slid into mental illness and spent years in a sanatorium, while his sisters married German aristocrats, several of them later tangled with the Nazi regime. Across the Channel, his father drifted to the south of France and a life of cards and mistresses. Into that vacuum stepped his uncle, Lord Louis Mountbatten, the ambitious and worldly figure who shaped the boy's career and steered him, some believe, toward the greatest match in Europe. When Philip married Princess Elizabeth in November 1947, the union demanded that he surrender nearly everything that defined him. He gave up a naval career at its most promising moment, abandoned the surname of the very man who molded him, and accepted a life inside a court that distrusted him as a foreign prince without a country or a fortune. Biographers such as Philip Eade in Young Prince Philip from 2011 and Giles Brandreth in his 2004 study, Philip and Elizabeth, Portrait of a Marriage, describe a restless personality boxed in by protocol he found absurd. Courtiers expected deference. Philip preferred banter. The old guard prized silence and ceremony, while he prized argument and the rough honesty of the wardroom. Within his inner circle, his female friends earned an open nickname, playmates, women who shared his appetite for philosophy, painting, or literature, and pulled him briefly free of the suffocating formality of palace life. The court that surrounded him bristled with quiet hostility from the first day. Senior courtiers, the men in grey who ran the monarchy behind its velvet curtain, regarded the young foreigner with suspicion and rarely troubled to hide it. They blocked his attempt to pass his own surname to his children. That defeat stung for years and provoked a bitter outburst about his diminished place. "No man in the entire country," he protested, "counted for less than a father forbidden to give his name to his own offspring, reduced to nothing more than a lowly organism in the royal scheme." Protocol forced him to walk several paces behind his wife and to bow where she received bows, surrendering his ship and his independence for a role with no constitutional definition whatsoever. The humiliations piled up quietly year upon year, and each one sharpened the restless edge that the gossip columns would soon learn to exploit. None of this proved that Philip strayed. It explained instead why so many believed he might. A handsome consort with a roving eye for clever conversation, a temper that flared at stuffy officials, and a flat refusal to behave like a decorous royal ornament presented the gossip columns with an irresistible character. The rumours that trailed him for the next 7 decades grew less from evidence than from temperament, and from a press that sensed a man who would never trouble himself to mount a defence. London in the years after the Second World War still carried the bruises of rationing and rubble, yet beneath the grey surface, a louche. Hard-drinking demimonde of actors and aristocrats partied as though the bombs might fall again tomorrow. Soho throbbed at the centre of it, a warren of clubs and smoky basement bars where titled "Men Mixed Freely with Showgirls and Spivs." The young Duke of Edinburgh, hemmed in, hungered for exactly that escape. Every Thursday, in a private room above Wheeler's Fish Restaurant in Soho, a collection of writers, actors, photographers, and aristocrats gathered for a long, liquid lunch. The wine flowed without restraint. The Thursday Club kept no minutes and admitted no women, and its members traded insults and ribald stories across tables groaning with oysters. Philip joined to keep a grip on the bachelor freedoms his marriage erased, and the company suited him perfectly. The actor, David Niven, the writer and raconteur, Peter Ustinov, and the society photographer Baron Nahum, who shot the young royal couple and counted the prince among his friends. Through Nahum, the club brushed against a name that would later detonate across British politics. Stephen Ward, a fashionable osteopath and gifted amateur portrait artist, occasionally turned up at the lunches, moving easily among the powerful as he treated their backs and sketched their faces. In 1963, that same Ward would sit at the wretched centre of the Profumo affair, the sex and espionage scandal that nearly toppled a government and ended in his own destruction. None of that lay in view during the cheerful Thursday lunches of the 1950s. Yet the club's loud reputation for heavy drinking and locker room talk handed the columnists exactly the backdrop they craved, and the simple fact of the prince's membership invited dark speculation about what else such men might share besides oysters and claret. At his side through many of those nights sat Mike Parker, an Australian naval officer, equerry to the prince and his closest accomplice in mischief. The two men shared a wartime sensibility and a flat refusal to let royal duty smother every last private pleasure. Parker accompanied Philip to the theatre and on to the clubs where the night stretched long past midnight, and his presence guaranteed that wherever the prince roamed, a witness and a partner roamed with him. Gossip columnists watched the pair slip out of the palace after dark and drew the obvious conclusion, ignoring the duller reality that two married men simply enjoyed a few hours away from official scrutiny. Parker later paid his own price for that closeness. His messy divorce in 1958 splashed across the newspapers and forced his resignation, dragging the prince's name into the coverage and feeding the impression, however unfair, of a royal household riddled with private vice. The royal family answered scandal with a single inherited doctrine: never complain, never explain. Buckingham Palace treated public denials as confessions of weakness, an admission that a rumour stung enough to merit a reply. Philip embraced that rule with more conviction than almost anyone around him. He loathed the press, distrusted its motives, and refused on principle to dignify gossip with a response, convinced that any denial only lent the lie a longer life. Writing to a friend about the rumours that dogged him, he set out his reasoning with weary precision. Litigation tempted him not at all. Short of launching libel proceedings, he argued, no remedy existed against the invasions of privacy and the invented quotations that formed the permanent bane of royal life, and so silence remained the only sane response. He clung to that position for the whole of his life, and it cost him friendships and reputations along the way. When reporters pressed him on the affair rumours, Philip pointed to one plain obstacle: How could he demanded, with a detective shadowing him night and day since 1947. The silence that swallowed every accusation only deepened the public mystery, because a man who never defends himself leaves the world free to imagine the very worst. The rumours travelled a strange road before they reached the public, and the journey reveals as much about Britain as about the prince. In the years right after the war, the national press treated the royal family with a reverence that modern readers would scarcely recognise. Editors knelt before the throne. Newspapers that cheerfully savaged politicians fell silent the moment a story brushed against the crown, and an unwritten code kept royal misbehaviour, real or imagined, locked safely out of print. The whispers about Philip and Pat Kirkwood circulated freely in private, traded at dinner parties and in Fleet Street bars, yet almost none of it reached the front pages in any direct form. Then the dam broke. The 1960s swept away the old deference in a single restless decade, and a new breed of journalist, irreverent and hungry, tore down the velvet curtain that once shielded the palace. Satirical magazines such as Private Eye mocked the powerful without mercy. Suddenly, the decades of accumulated gossip about the Duke of Edinburgh spilled into print all at once, arriving in a culture primed to believe the worst about its supposed betters. Philip, schooled in the older code of dignified silence, found himself defenceless against a press that no longer played by any of the rules he understood. One rumour outlasted all the others, and it began on a single night in 1948, darkening the reputation of a woman who never fully shook it off. Pat Kirkwood reigned as one of the brightest stars of the London stage, a singer and dancer whose legs critics ranked among the wonders of the West End. That autumn, with Princess Elizabeth at home and heavily pregnant with the future King Charles, Philip attended Kirkwood's performance alongside his equerry, Mike Parker. What unfolded next, stripped of the embroidery, amounts to an ordinary evening out. After the show, the prince invited Kirkwood, Parker, and Kirkwood's boyfriend, the photographer Baron Nahum, to dinner. The four of them dined together, drifted on to a nightclub afterward, and Philip and Kirkwood danced into the early hours while the other two looked on. That, by every documented account, covers the entire encounter. No private seduction appears anywhere in the contemporary record, only a group outing among friends of Nahum, one of whom happened to wear the title Duke of Edinburgh. Fleet Street required no more than that. London tabloids splashed the story across their pages in 1948 under headlines such as "Rendezvous with a Prince," turning a night of dancing into a clandestine romance. The timing supplied the poison, since a pregnant princess waiting at home rendered the imagined betrayal irresistible to readers. Editors understood the cold arithmetic of scandal, and a future queen wronged by her glamorous young husband sold far more copies than the dull truth of a chaperone dinner ever could. To grasp why the smear clung so tightly, you need to remember the sexual double standard of the age. A man linked to a showgirl suffered little. The showgirl wore the shame. Kirkwood, a working actress with no royal protection and no recourse, watched the gossip seep into her marriages and her bookings, a permanent stain attached to her name through no fault of her own. For the rest of her life she fought the story, and for the rest of her life it clung to her. She insisted, again and again, that nothing improper ever passed between them, and she begged both Philip and the palace to release a formal statement clearing her name. Philip refused. A denial, he reasoned, would only feed the flames and lend the gossip a credibility it never earned. Kirkwood, who watched the rumour shadow her career across 4 decades, never forgave him that silence. Her bitterness found its sharpest expression in a remark she delivered late in life. a line that flipped the era's double standard clean on its head. A lady, she pointed out, should never shoulder the task of defending her own honor. That duty falls to the gentleman. She mourned the calmer, happier life stolen from her, and pinned the blame squarely on a prince who turned up uninvited at her dressing room rather than spending the night quietly at home with his pregnant wife. The injustice of it lingered for the rest of the 20th century. Kirkwood never persuaded the palace to act, and only after her death in 2007 did the affair finally crumble under scrutiny. When her friend Michael Thornton published the correspondence between the actress and the prince about the damage the gossip caused, those letters revealed two people bound less by romance than by a shared exhaustion at a story neither could ever kill. A talented performer spent half her life branded a royal mistress on the strength of one evening's dancing, and the prince she supposedly seduced never once lifted a finger to set the record straight. Stardom never returned to its old height. Producers kept their distance from a woman entangled with the palace, and the brightest musical talent of her day faded into a footnote, remembered less for her voice than for a rumor she spent 40 years denying. If the Kirkwood rumor turned on a single evening, the next allegation reached into the bloodline itself. For years, London society murmured that Philip fathered a son by Hélène Corday, a French-born cabaret singer and nightclub hostess whose life tangled with the prince's from childhood. The boy at the center of the whisper, Max, entered the world in 1943, out of wedlock, before Corday married the Frenchman Marcel Boiseau. Rumors like that rarely need much fuel, and this one found plenty. Corday cut a striking figure in post-war London, presiding over fashionable nightclubs and moving through the same glittering circles that produced so much of the prince's gossip. Her connection to Philip ran genuinely deep and genuinely old. The two of them knew each other from their youth, a friendship close enough that he gave her away at her wedding and later became godfather to her children. When the time came for schooling, the prince quietly paid the fees for Max and his sister to attend Gordonstown, the austere Scottish boarding school that he himself once endured as a boy. The documented reality points somewhere far more ordinary. Corday's closeness to Philip belonged to the world of old friendship, not romance, and his financial help mirrored the fierce loyalty he showed many people who carried him through his fractured, rootless early years. The paternity claim, in any case, collapsed at the source. In 1988, Max Boiseau issued a public statement confirming that Marcel Boiseau, the man his mother married, fathered him and not the Duke of Edinburgh. A rumour that survived 4 decades on the strength of school fees and an old friendship died the moment the supposed royal son spoke plainly for himself. Corday's own story deserved better than its reduction to a footnote in someone else's scandal. Born Hélène Foufounou to a wealthy Greek family, she knew Philip from the sunlit summers of their shared childhood, 2 displaced children of a vanished European order. The war scattered that world. She fled occupied France and lost her first husband to the conflict, then rebuilt her life in London from almost nothing, clawing her way to the top of the capital's nightclub scene through sheer nerve. By the 1950s, she fronted her own television show and ran the fashionable Saddle Room, one of the first discotheques in the city. In her 1961 memoir, Born Bewildered, she addressed the swirling rumors about her son and her royal connection with a directness that revealed her weariness, refusing to feed the gossip, yet unable to silence it. A capable, self-reliant woman spent decades defined by a paternity rumor that the supposed child himself would eventually demolish. By 1963, Britain found itself convulsed by the most lurid political scandal of the century, and Prince Philip's name drifted, uninvited, into the wreckage. The Profumo affair erupted in a single revelation. The public learned that the Secretary of State for War, John Profumo, shared a mistress, the young model Christine Keeler, with a Soviet naval attaché at the height of the Cold War. That revelation fused two of the era's deepest anxieties, sex and espionage, into a single explosive story. Stephen Ward anchored the whole sordid drama, the osteopath and society fixer who steered Keeler into that dangerous orbit and whose trial and suicide would soon horrify the nation. Somewhere in the frenzy, a grotesque story fastened itself onto the Duke of Edinburgh. The tale, circulated by the satirical magazine Private Eye and the gossip of the moment, cast a mystery VIP as a naked waiter at decadent society parties, a man who supposedly served drinks wearing nothing but a tiny apron and a mask. Some versions of the legend christened the figure the Man in the Mask. Whispers pinned the role on Philip, even though the same rumour floated just as freely around the film director John Huston and an unnamed cabinet minister. No evidence ever placed the prince at any such gathering. What lent the smear even a flicker of plausibility traced back to one entirely innocent appointment. On the 9th of June, 1961, Stephen Ward sat with Prince Philip inside Buckingham Palace and sketched his portrait for the Illustrated London News, a commission arranged through their mutual acquaintance, Baron Nahum. A genuine meeting and a genuine drawing, 2 years before the scandal broke, left a paper trail that satirists could exploit. The prince posed for the very man who would become the affair's most notorious casualty. They needed nothing more. In a nation gripped by moral panic over sex scandals and the hidden vices of the powerful, the leap from a portrait sitting to an orgy demanded no proof at all, only a willing audience eager to think the worst of its rulers. Stephen Ward died by suicide in August 1963, midway through a trial that many historians now regard as a shabby judicial scapegoating, a sacrifice to a frightened establishment. The naked waiter dissolved with him, never confirmed, never tied to any real person, least of all to the prince. What lingered afterward only confirmed a lesson the palace already knew by heart. In the eyes of a scandal-hungry press, proximity could pass for proof. Philip's sole crime amounted to sitting still for a sketch. The wider hysteria explains why so flimsy a tale found such ready believers. That year, 1963, cracked something open in the British psyche. A nation raised on wartime sacrifice and post-war austerity suddenly confronted evidence that its rulers, the very men who preached duty and restraint, indulged in private appetites every bit as grubby as anyone else's. Trust in the establishment curdled almost overnight. Once the public accepted that a cabinet minister shared a mistress with a Soviet spy, no rumour about the powerful seemed too outlandish to credit, and the imagination raced to fill every shadowed corner of high society with secret orgies and masked servants. Prince Philip, visible and disliked in certain quarters for his arrogance, presented an inviting target for that paranoia. The naked waiter legend fed on a genuine collapse of public faith, a hunger to believe that the gilded figures at the top concealed something rotten, and the prince's portrait sitting with Stephen Ward supplied just enough thread to stitch him into the fantasy. Not every rumour sprang from a tabloid. The most serious allegation ever levelled against Philip arrived between the respectable covers of a published biography, and it named Alexandra Hamilton, Duchess of Abercorn, known to everyone simply as Sasha. 30 years younger than the prince, she shared with him an absorbing passion that pointed nowhere near the bedroom and everything toward the mind. The psychology of the Swiss thinker Carl Jung. For years, the two of them corresponded and talked at length about Jungian ideas, dreams, archetypes, and the buried workings of the inner life, a meeting of minds that outlasted decades. To Philip, restless and intellectually starved by the ceremonial grind of monarchy, such a companion supplied rare oxygen. Their bond ran deep and real. Whether it ever crossed into the physical became the question that one serious biographer chose to answer with startling confidence. In her 1996 book, Elizabeth, a Biography, the royal historian Sarah Bradford stated flatly that the prince and the duchess conducted a genuine romance. She allowed no qualification. Coming from a careful biographer rather than a gossip sheet, the verdict carried a weight no Fleet Street headline ever could, and in many later retellings it hardened quietly into accepted fact. Sacha herself rejected the claim flatly. She did so with an authority no critic could wave away, because Philip granted her his own personal permission to speak openly to Giles Brandreth for his 2004 portrait of the royal marriage. The Duchess used that rare freedom to deny any romance outright. She described a very close friendship, then drew the line without ambiguity, insisting she never once shared his bed. The whole thing, she suggested, stayed complicated and simple at the same time. The prince hunted for a playmate and someone to share his intellectual pursuits, and nothing beyond it. What drew them together ran deeper than idle talk. Sacha took Jung seriously, not as a fashion. She later founded a charitable foundation devoted to the psychologist's ideas about reconciliation and the divided mind. And she recognized in Philip a restless intelligence with no outlet, a man of real curiosity penned inside a role that demanded only ribbon-cutting and dignified silence. Their letters ran long and searching, year after year. The prince could find that kind of exchange almost nowhere else inside his gilded cage. She once described the bond in terms that captured its peculiar intensity without a whiff of romance, comparing it to two minds striking sparks off one another in the dark. To a man starved of stimulation, such a correspondent counted for more than any conventional mistress ever could, and that very depth, ironically, lent the affair rumour its surface plausibility. The most telling twist came from Bradford herself. By 2011, the biographer softened her once absolute verdict, conceding that she possibly drew the wrong conclusion about the affair. Her certainty, the only scholarly voice ever to assert the romance as fact, eroded across 15 years until even she would not stand fully behind it. The single pillar holding up the most credible version of the rumour cracked, leaving the allegation resting once again on denial and doubt. The final name belongs to Philip's last decades, and the rumour wrapped around it inflicted a crueler wound than any other, striking a widow in fresh grief and a man near the end of his life. Penelope Knatchbull, the Countess Mountbatten of Burma, entered the prince's life as the wife of his late mentor's grandson, and she became, by most accounts, the closest companion of his old age. 32 years his junior, she shared his devotion to carriage driving, the demanding equestrian sport he took up once polo grew too punishing for an aging body. Grief, too, drew them together. Penny Knatchbull lost her young daughter Leonora to kidney cancer in 1991. The blow bound her to a man long acquainted with exile and the sudden violent deaths of people he loved. His own beloved uncle, Lord Mountbatten, perished in 1979 when the IRA blew up his fishing boat off the Irish coast, killing a grandson alongside him. Two people scarred by sudden loss found in one another a quiet understanding that needed no explanation. Their friendship lasted 30 years, sustained by shared sorrow and a shared sport, and the prince treated her as a confidant in a way he extended to almost no one else alive. When Philip died in April 2021, in the depths of pandemic restrictions, only 30 mourners received permission to attend his funeral inside St. George's Chapel, and the names on that short list carried real meaning. Penny stood among them, one of the very few admitted from outside the immediate family. The choice told the world what she meant to him. Tabloids in the 1990s hinted at something more than companionship, and decades later, the Netflix drama The Crown staged their bond for millions in its 5th season, blurring the line between dramatized possibility and documented fact. Royal commentators who knew the relationship reacted with unusual fury. Ingrid Seward, a veteran chronicler of the family, dismissed the affair implication as cruel rubbish and exceedingly bad taste, and no shred of evidence ever pointed to their devotion running to anything other than companionship between two grieving friends. The backlash against that dramatization revealed how raw the subject remained. When the 5th season of The Crown arrived on Netflix in late 2022, less than 2 years after Philip's death, it portrayed the friendship with an intimacy that critics and royal watchers found grotesque in its timing. Commentators accused the writers of exploiting a real and recent grief for entertainment, of putting words and yearnings into the mouths of people who could no longer answer back. Friends of Penny Knatchbull described her distress at watching a private, painful bond repackaged as melodrama for a global audience. The episode crystallized a complaint that trailed the series for years, that a drama watched by tens of millions blurred the boundary between history and invention until casual viewers could no longer tell which parts actually happened. A grieving widow of the prince's circle paid the price for that blur. Beyond the headline names, a longer list of women drifted in and out of the rumour mill across the years, attached to Philip on the flimsiest of grounds. The novelist Daphne du Maurier, the Hollywood actress Merle Oberon, the television personality Katie Boyle, and Susan Barantes, mother of Sarah Ferguson, all surfaced at one point or another in the gossip columns as supposed conquests of the restless prince. None of these links holds together under the gentlest pressure, resting instead on a shared dinner here, a mutual acquaintance there, a columnist's idle hunch somewhere else. Not one survives contact with the documentary record. The names changed across the decades, yet the recipe stayed identical. Take an attractive woman, place her within 100 yards of Prince Philip, and let the imagination of the reader supply the rest. Beneath the noise lies the portrait of a particular kind of man, trapped inside a particular kind of life. The shape of it stays simple. Philip surrendered a career he loved and accepted permanent second place behind his own wife, spending his days inside a court whose rituals he privately despised. In Clever Women, in carriage-driving partners and students of Jung and stars of the old London stage, he found the stimulation and escape that the monarchy could never grant him. He sought out their wit and their talk, and a press that never grasped the line between friendship and seduction supplied all the rest. Consider what the alternative would require. For Philip to carry off even one of these affairs, he would need to evade a protection officer assigned to him around the clock from 1947 onward, deceive a wife famous for missing nothing, then secure the permanent silence of dozens of staff and courtiers across more than 70 years. Not a single valet or disgruntled former aide ever broke ranks with a credible account, in an era when royal servants sold lesser secrets to the tabloids for life-changing sums. The machinery of monarchy leaks constantly, yet on this supposedly juiciest of subjects it never leaked at all. A scandal of the scale the rumours imagined would leave fingerprints everywhere, and the historical record holds none of them. The simplest explanation usually carries the most weight, and the simplest explanation here points to a flirt, not a philanderer. The deepest irony sits at the very foundation of the legend. The same qualities that fed the rumours, his charm and his open contempt for the meek consort role he refused to play, also guaranteed that he would never once lower himself to deny a word of them. A more cautious man might simply issue the statements that would clear Pat Kirkwood's name or spare Penny Knatchbull her final humiliation. Philip, true to himself to the very end, chose silence over explanation every single time, and that silence, far more than any affair, built the myth that outlived him. He lies now beside his wife of 73 years in the King George VI Memorial Chapel at Windsor, the longest royal marriage in British history, sealed in stone. His secret, if any ever existed, died with him. The women whose names the tabloids tied to his outlived their usefulness to the scandal sheets and slipped from public memory, most of them recalled today only for a rumour they spent their lives denying. Whatever the prince truly thought about any of them, he carried it off unspoken, exactly as he always promised that he would. On November 20th, 1947, inside Marienburg Castle, somewhere in the bombed countryside of Lower Saxony, 3 women lean toward a wooden radio set. Static crackles through the speaker. A BBC announcer reads a guest list from Westminster Abbey. Foreign princes, exiled kings, dethroned emperors, ambassadors of countries no one in Europe could locate on a post-war map. The list grows long. Not one of those names belongs to the women in the room. The bridegroom in London happens to be their younger brother. His name now reads as Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, recently of His Majesty's Royal Navy, freshly minted Duke of Edinburgh, and within hours, the husband of the future Queen of England. None of his sisters appear in any photograph from the day, and none ride in the carriage processions. Their absence from the order of service required several months of careful drafting by Buckingham Palace courtiers, who treated the exclusion with the cold, mechanical attention diplomats normally reserve for border treaties. The newsreels never mentioned them. Wedding albums printed for the gift shop trade left them out entirely, and for the next 18 years, the British press would behave as though Prince Philip had grown up an only child. So how did 3 German princesses, blood relations of the future queen, end up listening to a royal wedding on a kitchen radio in a defeated country? Why did the Crown work so hard to bury them? What exactly lay buried in the family history London needed to scrub before the cameras began rolling at Westminster Abbey? The answer involves 4 marriages, 1 plane crash, 2 Wehrmacht uniforms, 1 SS rank, an intelligence agency that wiretapped half of Berlin, and a public relations operation so successful that even most modern royal biographers spent decades trying to recover the truth. Long before everything happened, a family in Athens slowly lost its country. Prince Andrew of Greece, younger son of King George I, lived an unsteady existence of military command and royal precarity. His wife, Princess Alice of Battenberg, born deaf at Windsor Castle, grew up across 3 languages and learned from childhood to read lips in any of them. 4 daughters arrived in rapid succession between 1905 and 1914: Margarita, Theodora, Cecilie, and Sophie. The boy came last. Philip, born in 1921 on a kitchen table at the family villa Mon Repos on Corfu, arrived 7 years after his closest sister as the only son in a household of girls who would scatter across Europe before he reached his teens. In 1922, the Greco-Turkish War ended in catastrophe. Greek armies broke under Turkish counterattack across Anatolia, and King Constantine, Andrew's brother, faced a second forced abdication. An Athens military tribunal executed 6 senior officers for treason. Prince Andrew, charged with disobedience for his conduct at the Battle of Sakarya, came within a week of joining them at the firing wall. British intervention saved him. King George V, alarmed at the prospect of yet another murdered cousin so soon after the Russian massacres of 1918, dispatched the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Calypso to evacuate the family from Corfu. The infant Philip travelled across the Mediterranean in an orange crate converted into a cot. Family members disembarked in Brindisi and settled in a borrowed house in St. Cloud on the western edge of Paris. No savings cushioned them. The household ran on charity from wealthier Battenberg relatives and the slow generosity of the French branch of the family, while no Greek pension ever arrived to ease the situation. Within a decade, the family disintegrated. By 1930, Princess Alice had collapsed under a severe nervous breakdown and entered Bellevue Sanatorium in Switzerland under the care of psychiatrists who included, briefly and ineffectively, Sigmund Freud. Prince Andrew abandoned the household for the French Riviera, where he lived modestly on borrowed money and the affection of a mistress until his death in a Monte Carlo hotel room in 1944. Philip lost his mother at 8, and he would not see her again for 5 years. The 4 daughters, meanwhile, did what unprotected princesses of fallen houses had done for centuries. They married. Between 1930 and 1931, the sisters walked down the aisle in a rolling sequence of weddings across central Germany. Sophie married first in December 1930 at the age of 16 to Prince Christoph of Hesse, followed by Cecily, who wed Georg Donatus of Hesse in February 1931. Margarita took her vows opposite Gottfried, hereditary Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, in April, and Theodora joined herself to Berthold, Margrave of Baden, in August. The whole sequence took 8 months. To outside observers, this resembled a triumphant rescue. Within a single calendar year, 4 daughters of a broke, exiled, dishonoured royal house had married into the highest tier of the German Hochadel. The surviving princely families, whose castles and estates had outlived the collapse of the Kaiserreich, family finances stabilized, social standing recovered, and the younger brother, scattered between English boarding schools and occasional summer visits, suddenly enjoyed 4 wealthy households across Germany willing to take him in for the holidays. Philip spent much of his childhood ricocheting between these 4 sisters. Schulschloss Salem accepted him as a pupil through Theodora's family connection until the rise of Nazi power forced his transfer to Gordonstown in Scotland in 1934. Summers at Wolfsgarten with Cecily passed in long walks through Hessian forest on Margarita's estates in Baden-Württemberg he hunted, and in the gardens at Friedrichshof Sophie's small children played beside him. By every available account, those years marked the happiest period of his disrupted boyhood. The trouble lurking behind those castles between 1931 and 1939 belonged to the Germany taking shape around them, the one about to absorb every one of his brothers-in-law. The 4 brothers-in-law experienced the Third Reich very differently. Berthold, Margrave of Baden, ranked the cleanest. His family treated Hitler with open coldness from the beginning. A Baden grandfather had occupied the office of Imperial Chancellor under Kaiser Wilhelm II. Berthold's father had founded Schule Schloss Salem in part to produce a German elite resistant to authoritarian politics, a project whose Jewish co-founder, Kurt Hahn, fled to Britain in 1933 to escape arrest. Berthold himself protected what he could of the school and of Salem Abbey. When war came, the Wehrmacht conscripted him and posted him to the invasion of France in 1940 as a cavalry lieutenant, where shellfire wounded him badly near Soissons. That wound ended his active military career, after which he spent the rest of the war managing his estates and quietly negotiating around the regime he never trusted. Allied denazification tribunals cleared him entirely. Gottfried of Hohenlohe-Langenburg occupied a grayer position. He formally joined the Nazi Party on May 1, 1937, with membership number 4,023,070. May 1, 1937 fell. On the same day, the party reopened its rolls after a 4-year freeze on new members, and tens of thousands of opportunistic German aristocrats joined in a single coordinated wave designed to protect their estates and businesses. Gottfried rose to Oberstleutnant in the Wehrmacht. Eastern Front shrapnel left him severely wounded. After the war, British military authorities classified him as a Mitläufer, a follower, which sat below the more serious categories of major offender or activist. He kept Schloss Langenburg, kept his name, and carried that classification for the rest of his life. His grandson still occupies that castle today. Georg Donatus of Hesse held roughly the same shade of grey. He and Cecilie joined the party together on May 1, 1937, swept up in the same enrollment wave as Gottfried. Hessian historians have generally read the membership as an attempt to protect family interests inside the Grand Duchy of Hesse and by Rhine, where the Nazi regional administration kept making increasingly aggressive demands on aristocratic estates. Whether Georg Donatus held strong ideological convictions remains a question no archive has fully resolved. He died, alongside Cecilie, before he could either prove or disprove them. And then there came Sophie's husband. The fourth brother-in-law. He happened to be the one no quantity of post-war public relations could ever quite scrub clean. Prince Christoph of Hesse joined the Nazi Party in 1931 at the age of 20. The party still wielded no national power, still operated none of the institutions that would later make membership lucrative or coercive, and offered nothing in 1931 except ideology and street violence. He then entered the SS in 1932. By the time war broke out, Christoph wore the rank of SS Oberführer, a senior officer grade roughly equivalent to a brigadier in modern terms. He moved through the inner circles of the regime with the easy familiarity of someone present since the beginning. Hermann Göring counted him as a personal friend. Christoph named his first son, born in 1937, Karl Adolf. The middle name a tribute to the Führer. His most consequential appointment came in 1935. The Forschungsamt, the Reich Research Office, functioned as Göring's secret intelligence service. Officially, it studied radio frequencies. Actually, it tapped phones. Its lines reached foreign embassies in Berlin, cabinet ministers, generals, Jewish families, dissidents, journalists, and rival Nazis whom Göring did not trust. It produced what its analysts called brown pages, daily intelligence summaries circulated to the top of the regime. It grew into one of the most powerful instruments of Nazi state surveillance. The office's founder, Hans Schimpf, died in April 1935 from what official records labeled suicide. The historian Jonathan Petropoulos, who spent years inside the Hesse family archives, has noted that the circumstances never received satisfactory explanation and that several senior figures inside the regime carried reasons to want Schimpf dead. Whatever happened to Schimpf, his replacement already stood ready. Göring appointed Prince Christoph of Hesse, the husband of Prince Philip's favourite sister Sophie, as the new Leiter of the Forschungsamt. Petropoulos has documented the next several years in detail. Christoph and his elder brother Philip of Hesse functioned as aristocratic ornaments for the regime, lending old names and older castles to the Nazi project of legitimizing itself before the European elite. They appeared in newsreels, their photographs running in glossy Reich propaganda magazines beside their wives and children. Hitler dined at family estates. Sophie, by every account she later gave, threw herself into the role with the same enthusiasm. Decades later, in an unpublished memoir written near the end of her life, Sophie described a 1935 dinner with Hitler. She recalled finding him charming and seemingly modest. Hugo Vickers, who reproduced the passage in his work on Princess Alice, also recovered the qualification that always disappears in the internet versions of the quote. Sophie added that she and Christoph had changed our political views fundamentally after the war began. Whether that change felt real, retrospective, or convenient depends on which historian you ask. Christoph died on October 7, 1943. His plane crashed into a mountainside in the Italian Apennines during a Luftwaffe transport flight. After the war, family members floated the story that he had grown disillusioned with the regime and that Himmler's people had quietly murdered him. Petropoulos, working from the actual flight records and the contemporaneous Luftwaffe accident report, found no evidence for that account. The crash matches exactly what officials recorded at the time: a wartime aviation accident in poor weather. Sophie reached 28 that autumn. She had 5 children to raise on her own. The youngest, Clarissa, born only 2 months before her father's plane crashed into the Apennines. Prince Philip's brother-in-law had run Goering's wiretap service. No public relations operation in Buckingham Palace history could ever make that disappear. On November 16, 1937, a Sabena Airlines Junkers Ju 52 lifted off from Frankfurt that morning, bound for Croydon Aerodrome south of London. But weather over the English Channel had collapsed into thick autumn fog. Visibility along the Belgian coast dropped to almost nothing. At approximately 10:50 inches the morning, the pilot, Tony Lambot, attempted an unscheduled landing at Steen Aerodrome near Ostend. The aircraft clipped a brick factory chimney at low altitude and burned on impact. 11 people died, including the entire passenger manifest. 6 of those passengers belonged to the House of Hesse. Princess Cecilie, Prince Philip's third sister, then 26 years old and 8 months pregnant, sat among them. Her husband Georg Donatus, who had inherited the titular Grand Duchy of Hesse only 5 weeks earlier, occupied another seat. Their 2 young sons, Ludwig and Alexander, aged 6 and 4, travelled with them. Their travelling companion, Georg Donatus's mother Eleonore, the Dowager Grand Duchess, completed the family party. An infant daughter, Johanna, had stayed behind on the ground with a Darmstadt nurse, and meningitis would take her life the following year. The family had travelled toward London for the wedding of Georg Donatus's younger brother, Prince Louis of Hesse. The ceremony had originally fallen on a date in October. Ernst Ludwig, the head of the House of Hesse, had died in early October before the wedding could take place. Family members postponed by 6 weeks out of mourning and then chose this particular November flight to reach England in time for the rescheduled ceremony. A widely repeated detail from royal biographies asserts that Princess Cecilie went into labour during the flight and that the pilot attempted his desperate Ostend landing precisely because a woman lay giving birth in the cabin. The story has stuck for nearly 90 years. It traces back to contemporaneous press coverage, which reported that rescuers found the remains of a newborn infant in the wreckage near Cecilia's body. Aviation forensics specialists, familiar with high-energy crash dynamics, have long pointed out that the violent decompression and blunt force trauma of an aircraft impact can produce what pathologists call post-mortem fetal expulsion. Catastrophic abdominal injury forces a near-term fetus out of the body in the moments around death. An infant's presence in the wreckage proves only that Cecilie had carried the child close to term. It does not prove she had entered active labor in the cabin. Lambott's exact motivation for descending into the Ostend fog will probably never come to light. What the record documents in detail begins with what came afterward. The funeral took place 6 days later in Darmstadt. Prince Louis, the bridegroom whose wedding had vanished into delay, married his bride, Margaret Geddes, in a quiet civil ceremony in London on the morning of November 17, then travelled directly to Germany for the burial of his entire immediate family. Princess Alice of Battenberg, released from a Bavarian sanatorium for the occasion, met her son Philip in Darmstadt for the first time in years. Heavy press coverage followed the procession. 16-year-old Prince Philip walked at the front of the cortege, the youngest male member of the family present, dressed in a dark suit and overcoat against the November cold. He marched between Lord Mountbatten on one side and his cousin Prince Philip of Hesse on the other. Behind him followed relatives in the full uniforms of the SA and the SS. Crowds lined the streets of Darmstadt, and many raised their right arms in the Hitler salute as the coffins passed. That photograph survives. It appears in almost every serious account of the British monarchy's complicated relationship with the Third Reich, and it exists as the visible, undeniable evidence that one of the future Queen of England's brothers-in-law would soon become a permanent diplomatic catastrophe. In November 1937, the image resembled nothing more than a family in mourning. By 1947, the same photograph would become a document the palace urgently needed to keep out of newspapers. Two years after the funeral in Darmstadt, the British and German branches of Prince Philip's family went to war with each other. Philip entered the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth in May 1939, 3 months before the invasion of Poland. He had renounced his Greek titles only the year before and now travelled, for naval purposes, as Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark, 18 years old, foreign by birth and uncertain by nationality. The British state had no idea what to do with him. An extinct king for an uncle, cousin, relationships across British royalty, and brother-in-law connections to multiple serving Wehrmacht officers created a diplomatic puzzle. He also ranked demonstrably among the most able cadets the college had seen in years. The Royal Navy decided to take the chance. He commissioned as a midshipman in January 1940. By the autumn of that year, he sailed aboard HMS Valiant in the Mediterranean. In March 1941, during the night battle of Cape Matapan against the Italian fleet, he ran the searchlights that illuminated the Italian cruisers Zara and Fiume for the British battleships to destroy. The action sank 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers and killed more than 2,300 Italian sailors. Philip received a mention in dispatches and the Greek War Cross. At precisely the same period, 2 of his brothers-in-law fought on the Eastern Front. Gottfried of Hohenlohe-Langenburg suffered serious wounds near Smolensk in 1941. Georg Donatus's younger brother, Prince Philip of Hesse, worked as a liaison officer between Hitler and Mussolini, a role he performed inside the inner circles of the regime until Italy's surrender in 1943 brought his arrest by the Gestapo and imprisonment in Flossenburg and Dachau concentration camps. Christoph of Hesse remained at the Forschungsamt, transferred to a Luftwaffe staff position, and then died in the 1943 plane crash. Berthold of Baden, invalided out after his wound in France, sat the war out on his estates. The 3 surviving German sisters did what their class did during war. They managed households and sometimes sheltered refugees moving west ahead of the Red Army. Sewing, cooking with rationing cards, raising their children, and listening anxiously to news from Russia filled the days, while they tried not to think about the brother fighting on the wrong side. Philip and his sisters held almost no contact for 6 years. Mail across the lines remained impossible. Diplomatic channels stayed closed. The Red Cross occasionally passed brief notes between separated families, but the rules limited messages to 25 words and forbade any reference to military matters, location, or politics. Notes that survive between Philip and Sophie, between Philip and Theodora, between Philip and Margarita read brief, blank, and almost unbearably restrained. I am well. The children are well. Mother is in Greece. Sentences that could pass any censor in Berlin or London. Decades later, in a rare moment of reflection, Philip would describe the period with the flat practicality that became his lifelong defense against sentimentality. It was simply what happened. The family broke up. My mother was ill, my sisters were married, my father was in the south of France. I just had to get on with it. He carried on, fought, survived, and returned to a Britain whose surviving public memory held no patience for the complications of a divided family. In the late summer of 1947, the British government, the royal household, and the personal advisors of King George VI sat down to draft the guest list for the wedding of Princess Elizabeth. The bride's side drafted itself. A groom's side opened a nightmare. Philip's mother passed every political test. Princess Alice of Battenberg had spent the war in Athens, where she sheltered a Jewish family, the Cohens, in her apartment for the duration of the Nazi occupation. Yad Vashem would later honor her as righteous among the nations. Deaf, eccentric, and about to found an Orthodox nursing order and wear a grey nun's habit to the ceremony, she still carried a clean political record. Philip's father had died years earlier. That problem solved itself. Philip's surviving sisters opened a different matter entirely. Margarita's husband Gottfried had carried a Nazi party card and a Wehrmacht commission. Theodora's husband Berthold had worn the Wehrmacht uniform, though minimally. Sophie remained the widow of an SS Oberführer who had directed the Forschungsamt, and her second husband, Georg Wilhelm of Hanover, had also held a Wehrmacht commission. Cecilie lay dead, killed at Ostend a decade earlier, but the absence of one sister could not compensate for the presence of 3. In the autumn of 1947, the British public held no appetite for German aristocrats on the Buckingham Palace balcony. Bread rationing had begun in 1946, 2 years after the war ended. Meat still came under ration, as did tea, while whole districts of the East End of London still lay in rubble. The Nuremberg trials had concluded 11 months earlier. Newsreels had shown the British public the gates of Belsen, the ovens of Auschwitz, the bodies stacked along the rail sidings. Anti-German feeling in Britain in 1947 ran higher than at any point during the war itself. The decision came down through Buckingham Palace. 3 German sisters would not receive invitations. In private memoranda, the decision traced back to King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, working in consultation with the Foreign Office and the Lord Chamberlain. Royal household courtiers received instructions to manage the matter discreetly. No formal announcement would issue. Press desks would simply not learn of the existence of the German relatives. Photographs from Philip's childhood that included his sisters would not reach release. Official engagement portraits would foreground his Mountbatten heritage and his British naval career. The word German would never appear in any official statement about the bridegroom. Margarita, Theodora, and Sophie learned of the exclusion through private letter. They accepted without public complaint, knowing their realities and understanding, perhaps better than anyone in London, what the optics of a German princess in the Abbey would do to their brother's marriage. They listened to the wedding on the radio at Marienburg Castle. When the BBC announcer signed off, they switched off the set and walked to lunch. No record survives of what they discussed. Behind the exclusion of the three sisters stood one of the most determined image management operations in 20th century royal history. Its architect, Lord Mountbatten. Louis Mountbatten, born Prince Louis of Battenberg in 1900, had spent his entire adult life remaking himself as the most British member of his German family. His father resigned as First Sea Lord in October 1914 during a wave of anti-German hysteria over the family's Battenberg surname. The same hysteria had pushed King George V to abandon Saxe-Coburg-Gotha in 1917 and rebrand the dynasty as the House of Windsor. Mountbatten grew up watching his family disappear behind a screen of English nouns and English uniforms. He understood with surgical clarity what it took to gain admission into the inner ring of British royalty. He spent the 1930s and 1940s applying the same lessons to his nephew. Philip arrived in Britain in 1928 as a Greek prince of mixed German, Danish, and Russian heritage, born on a Greek island, raised in France, with most of his immediate family resident in Germany. Mountbatten began the long, slow work of converting him into a credible English naval officer. He arranged Philip's transfer from Schule Schloss Salem to Gordonstown, paid much of the school fees from his own income, supervised the boys' holidays, and pushed him toward the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth. Renunciation of Greek and Danish titles followed. So did the use of Mountbatten, the anglicised version of Battenberg, as a new surname when Philip received naturalisation as a British subject in February 1947. That naturalisation involved its own quiet sleight of hand. Philip's three German brothers-in-law could not appear in the parliamentary documents. Foreign relative lists required for a Home Office application underwent careful truncation. The Foreign Office collaborated, as did the Home Office, as did the Privy Council. By the time Philip walked into Westminster Abbey on November 20, 1947, his official British identity contained no German relatives at all. Mountbatten had achieved his life's project. He had successfully converted a foreign-born prince of a deposed dynasty into the husband of the next Queen of England, with no diplomatic incident and no public scandal. The sisters paid the price of the operation, and Mountbatten paid it without apparent regret. Queen Mary, the bridegroom's grandmother-in-law, supported the effort with the cold institutional memory of someone who had lived through 1917. She remembered crowds throwing rocks at German shop windows in London, and her own husband signing the proclamation that erased Saxe-Coburg-Gotha from the family name. She had no intention of repeating the experience. King George VI signed off because his throne required it. The crown had outlived 4 European monarchies in the space of 3 years. Italy voted out the Savoy dynasty in 1946. Bulgaria scrapped its kingdom that same year. Romania pushed out its king in December 1947. Yugoslavia had abolished its monarchy back in 1945. The British monarchy remained the only one of the original Saxe-Coburg-Gotha cousinhood still standing in Western Europe, and George VI held no intention of testing public patience with a balcony full of Hessian princesses. The exclusion of November 1947 stretched into permanence. The sisters visited the United Kingdom privately and saw their brother and their sister-in-law in small family gatherings at Windsor and Sandringham. Theodora and Margarita became godmothers to several of Philip and Elizabeth's children. Sophie remained particularly close to Princess Anne, the second-born, and would later become her informal European confidant. They wrote, they telephoned, They sent presents at Christmas, and the relationship endured behind a wall of silence the British press maintained without ever putting the policy in writing. That relationship simply never reached photographs. The coronation of 1953 illustrates the policy at its most precise. All three sisters received invitations. None appeared in the carriage processions or reached the official coronation portraits. They sat in Westminster Abbey, but at positions the photographers, briefed by the royal household, did not cover. The Cecil Beaton photographs that defined the public image of the new Queen included Philip's mother in her grey habit, but none of his sisters. A casual viewer of the coronation footage in 1953 could have watched the entire broadcast and concluded that Prince Philip had grown up with his mother and no one else. Authorized biographies of Philip during the 1950s and 1960s repeated the same omission. Basil Boothroyd's 1971 official biography, written with the Duke's full cooperation, discusses his German sisters with the brevity of a man trying to clear a throat. Their names appear without descriptions. Marriages get mentioned, the husbands do not, and the war years fold over while the page turns. When pressed by occasional journalists, the palace returned the same line. The Duke maintained close family relations with his surviving sisters. His sisters had not received invitations to certain public events out of consideration for their own privacy. Nothing further to add. A great deal further could indeed have been added. The royal household simply preferred not to add it. The sisters themselves rarely spoke to the press. When they did so in German, to German publications, in tones that made British editors uncomfortable enough to leave the material alone. Sophie gave one notable interview in the early 1980s in which she discussed her first marriage with unsentimental honesty, acknowledging her family's support of the regime and her own youthful enthusiasm for it. The interview ran in stern. It did not reach British newspapers in any detail until decades later. The silence held. Across 18 years, the British monarchy operated a kind of half-acknowledged, never-stated, fully understood policy of editorial erasure regarding the German wing of the Mountbatten-Windsor family. That policy came up for review in May 1965. In May 1965, Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip made the first state visit of a British monarch to West Germany since the 1909 visit of King Edward VII. The trip lasted 11 days and covered 7 cities. Diplomats on both sides treated it as the largest single act of repair between the two countries in the 20 years since the end of the war. That same trip, quietly, opened the door for Philip's sisters to return to the official photographic record. On May 24, the royal party visited Schloss Langenburg, the seat of the Hohenlohe-Langenburg family in Baden-Württemberg. Princess Margarita had reached 60 years of age. She greeted her sister-in-law, the Queen, on the steps of the castle in front of carefully arranged press photographers and a delegation of West German officials. Photographs ran in the British papers the next day, captioned with brief, neutral descriptions. Princess Margarita, sister of the Duke of Edinburgh. Schloss Langenburg, family seat of the Hohenlohe-Langenburg family. A first visit by the Queen. Later in the same trip, the royal party travelled to Salem, the estate of the Margrave of Baden, where Theodora hosted her sister-in-law for lunch. Sophie attended the same gathering. 3 sisters, 2 of them widowed, all of them in their 50s and 60s, sat at the lunch table with the Queen of England. For the first time in any setting, the British press received permission to acknowledge. Photographs from that lunch read, "By royal standards, almost domestic in their ordinariness. The sisters wear pearls, the Queen a printed silk dress, and Philip stands behind his chair with his arms folded." Nothing dramatic emerges from the images, and that fact carries the point. Those images had to look undramatic, suggesting that the German relatives had always sat quietly there, always received visits, always belonged to the family. Previous absence from the public record vanished retroactively through the simple production of new images. The 1965 visit did not erase 18 years of editorial suppression, but it did establish that the suppression no longer applied. From 1965 forward, the sisters held visible status again, free to appear in photographs, in names, and in mentions across British newspapers that had behaved for 2 decades as if they did not exist. The press relaxed its grip. Margarita died in 1981 at Bad-Wiessee, Theodora having died in 1969. Sophie, the last surviving sister, lived until November 2001. She outlived her brother's wife by a year, her brother by 20 years, and her first husband's regime by 56 years. In her last interview, given in German to a regional Bavarian paper, she discussed her brother with deep affection and her first marriage with what her interviewer described as a kind of weary, archaeological precision. The interviewer asked whether she had forgiven the British press for the years of silence. She replied that nothing required forgiveness because she had never expected anything different. That answer carried perhaps the most honest assessment any member of the family ever gave of the situation. On April 17, 2021, Prince Philip received burial at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The Duke had died 9 days earlier at the age of 99. Pandemic regulations restricted the funeral to 30 guests. The royal household, working with Philip's own pre-arranged plans, drew up the guest list with the careful precision of an estate executor. 3 of the 30 seats went to German relatives. Bernhard, hereditary Prince of Baden, Theodora's grandson, attended on behalf of his line. Prince Donatus, Landgrave of Hesse, the head of the modern House of Hesse and descendant of Sophie's second marriage, attended on behalf of his. Prince Philip Hohenlohe-Langenburg, Margarita's grandson, attended on behalf of his. The princes numbered 3, 1 for each surviving German line, 3 men whose grandfathers had worked for the regime that Britain had spent the autumn of 1947 trying to scrub from the family record. They arrived because Philip had asked for them to arrive. He had drafted the list himself over the preceding decades, reviewed it, updated it, and insisted, against the natural caution of the palace, that the 3 German lines receive representation at his own burial. Footage of the funeral ran on every British network. The German princes received names in the official commentary, their relationships to the Duke received description, and their grandfathers received no mention. Royal household policy had moved, after 74 years, from active erasure to selective acknowledgement, but not yet to full disclosure. The grandfathers, with their party numbers and their SS ranks and their Forschungsamt offices, remained outside the official narrative. Philip's final correction landed here: incomplete. Given what had undergone suppression for the previous 3/4 of a century, it amounted to the most that the institution could publicly admit. Even today, the family the palace tried to bury has not gone anywhere. The Hohenlohe-Langenburgs still live at Schloss Langenburg, the House of Baden still owns Salem, and the House of Hesse still occupies its estates near Frankfurt. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of Margarita, Theodora, and Sophie hold their titles, manage their forests, run their wine estates, and occasionally appear in the foreign news pages of British papers when one of them marries. That institution, Buckingham Palace, spent 18 years pretending did not exist, remains, as of this recording, very much in business. Their brother walked into Westminster Abbey on November 20, 1947, and joined the royal family of the United Kingdom. while the cameras of the British Empire recorded every step. They listened on a radio in Lower Saxony. The palace secured what it wanted. What his sisters received, in the end, amounted to the radio. October 2018. Princess Eugenie marries at Windsor, and after the ceremony, the photographer herds the family into the green drawing room for the official portraits. And that is where it happens. Two people stand inside the same frame for the first time since 1992. One of them, Prince Philip. The other, Sarah Ferguson, 26 years. That measures the gap since these two last shared a single photograph. Sit with that number for a second, because it genuinely unsettles same family. Same Windsor estate, where both spent huge chunks of the year. Grandfather-in-law on one side, the mother of his two granddaughters on the other. For a quarter of a century, the royal household ran a quiet, daily, almost military operation across the grounds of Windsor toward one purpose only: keeping the Duke of Edinburgh from ever laying eyes on her. Most people, when they fall out with an in-law, handle it the boring way. A cold Christmas, a clipped hello over the gravy. Maybe you conveniently catch a stomach bug the weekend of the christening, mail a card at some point, and let the years sand the edges off the grudge until nobody quite remembers what started it. Philip did not do boring, and he did not do forgetting. He drew a line through Sarah Ferguson's name and kept it sharp and uncrossed until the day he died, almost 3 decades on. So the obvious question, the one you clicked on this video to hear answered, comes out simple. What on earth did she do? What does a person pull off to earn a freeze-out this total from a man who spent 70 years married to her aunt by marriage, sat through every family scandal going, and still found room in his life for almost everyone? Stay with me, because the answer turns messier, colder, and weirdly more brutal than the tabloid version you have been sold. A detail nobody puts in the thumbnail: at the start, Philip liked her. He really did. Rewind to 1985. Prince Andrew, the Queen's second son and her not-so-secret favourite, starts dating a tall, freckled, loud, laughing redhead named Sarah Margaret Ferguson. Sarah grows up around horses and polo fields. Her father manages polo for Prince Charles, and she crashes into royal life with the energy of someone who has never once worried about which fork to use. She tells jokes that land, rides hard, and treats the stuffiest people in Britain like old drinking buddies. Her path into that world ran through a childhood that left scars. Sarah's father, Major Ronald Ferguson, managed polo for Prince Charles, which planted her on the fringes of royal life from girlhood. Her mother, though, packed up and left in Sarah's early teens, running off to Argentina with a dashing polo player named Hector Barrantes and building a brand new life an ocean away. A daughter raised on that kind of early abandonment grows up hungry for approval, desperate to belong, allergic to being left out. Hold on to that hunger. It explains a great deal of what follows, including why the freeze, once it came, would cut her so deep. She and Andrew circled the same world for years, and it took Princess Diana, her old friend, to nudge the two together at Royal Ascot in 1985. Diana wanted an ally inside the family, someone fun on her side of the moat. For a brief, bright stretch, she landed exactly that, and the family eats it up. Especially Philip, because Philip, for all his fearsome reputation, spent his whole life surrounded by people too terrified to act normal around him. Then in walks Fergie, who refuses to flinch, refuses to grovel, and shares the one passion he guarded like treasure: carriage driving. The Duke of Edinburgh obsessed over carriage driving. He basically invented the modern competitive version of the sport, wrote its rule books, and spent his weekends being hauled around the countryside behind a team of horses well into his 80s. Sarah took it up too, and the pair bonded over it the way you bond with someone over the niche hobby nobody else in the family understands. Ingrid Seward, who wrote a whole biography of Sarah, paints those early years as genuinely warm. Royal insiders echoed her. Fergie blew a gust of fresh air through a house that ran, year after year, on tradition, rigid silence, and the careful suppression of every feeling anyone happened to have. After the buttoned-up agony of the Charles and Diana marriage, here stood a daughter-in-law who actually seemed to enjoy herself. For a little while, she carried the role of great hope, the one who pulled it off. The one who proved the monarchy could let a real, messy, human personality through the front gates without the whole building collapsing. You already know it does not last. Before we watch the whole thing fall apart, you need to meet the man holding the eraser, because the frieze only makes sense once you grasp what the crown meant to Philip and where that devotion came from. A second irony nobody mentions in the toe photo retellings: Prince Philip, the great unbending guardian of royal dignity, opened his own life as a penniless, stateless refugee with no country to call his own. He entered the world in 1921 on a dining table on the Greek island of Corfu, a prince of Greece and Denmark by blood and not much else in practice. Barely a year and a half old, he watched a revolution chase his family out of Greece, and the legend holds that the British Navy spirited the infant prince to safety in a cot fashioned from an old fruit crate. His childhood afterward turned scattered and rootless. Inside a sanatorium, his mother, Princess Alice, spent years wrestling a breakdown and a diagnosis of schizophrenia. His father drifted off to the south of France to live quietly with a mistress. Sisters married off into German aristocracy, some of it later tangled with the Nazi regime, while young Philip bounced between relatives across Europe with no fixed home, no fortune, and no nation that claimed him. So when a freckled, broke young woman married into the most secure family in Britain and then traded on it to survive, Philip recognized the shape of it. He lived a harder version himself. He knew exactly how it felt to stand at the gates of a grand institution with empty pockets. The difference lies in what each of them did once inside. Philip burned the boats behind him. He renounced his Greek and Danish titles, took British citizenship, walked away from a naval career the men around him swore would reach the very top, and signed himself over to a lifetime of pacing 3 steps behind his wife, with no power of his own and no salary worth the name. More than 22,000 engagements followed. Decade after decade, all of it poured into an institution he treated as something close to holy. He forged the deprivation of his youth into a code of total sacrifice. Sarah handed the same golden door, drew the opposite conclusion. When her money ran out, she sold what she owned. To a man who surrendered everything and demanded nothing, her choice carried no whiff of survival. It carried the stink of betrayal, a sellout of the only thing he held sacred. He could never forgive her for failing the test he passed. Andrew and Sarah marry on the 23rd of July, 1986, at Westminster Abbey, and roughly 500 million people around the world tune in to watch. She becomes the Duchess of York. He becomes, briefly, one half of the most cheerful couple in the family. The crowds love her, the press loves her for now, and the Queen, by every account, adores her. A famous story gets repeated in nearly every article about Fergie, and I want to flag it right now because it carries the ring of truth and probably holds none. The story goes that Philip pulled the new Duchess aside and warned her, "Now that you sit inside the firm, you can do whatever you like, but you will always be found out." Ominous. Cinematic. Perfect for a documentary. Honestly, the trouble lies in the source. That exact line traces back to a single 1996 tell, all written by a former friend of Sarah's who carried a book to sell and a grudge to settle, and historians touch it with a barge pole. So I will not hand it to you as gospel. If Philip ever voiced anything like it, no reliable record survives. What survives instead reads much duller. He welcomed her, liked her, and assumed she would manage fine. She would not stay fine. The marriage strains almost from the start, and the cause runs brutally simple. Andrew, a serving naval officer, vanished to sea for enormous stretches, sometimes the better part of a year, leaving his brand-new wife alone inside the most scrutinized family on the planet with nothing to do and nowhere to hide. Boredom set in, then loneliness behind it. The press, after crowning her, started measuring her waistline and inventing nicknames that stung. And a woman who once charmed a room full of dukes drifted into the choices that turn charm into ammunition. To understand why one set of photographs detonated the way it did, you need the backdrop of what kind of year 1992 already turned into inside the palace. The Queen herself later branded it her annus horribilis, her horrible year, and she chose the word carefully. Sarah's own marriage crumbled quietly well before any camera delivered the killing blow. Early in 1992, a stack of holiday photographs surfaced, showing her relaxed and far too cozy with a Texan oil heir named Steve Wyatt, the kind of pictures a married duchess very much does not want loose in the world. Someone reportedly left the images behind in a London flat where a cleaner stumbled onto them, the sort of detail no scriptwriter would dare invent. By March, Andrew and Sarah confirmed their formal separation. On paper, the marriage collapsed months before summer even arrived. June 1992. Andrew Morton publishes Diana, her true story, and the book lands like a grenade rolled under the throne. It reveals, with a level of detail nobody can explain away, that Princess Diana lives miserable, that the Charles marriage lies in ruins, that she has fought her own mental health and self-harm, and that the fairy tale the public swallowed in 1981 curdled into a lie from the altar. The whole country reels. The palace, an institution built on the iron rule of never airing your laundry, suddenly flaps its dirtiest sheets on every front page in the world. And nobody yet knows the worst part. Diana herself secretly cooperated with the book. The monarchy bleeds, the press smells blood, and every reporter in Britain now hunts the next royal humiliation. Guess who hands it to them? 2 months. That gap separates Morton's book from what came next. 2 months after the institution swallowed the worst public beating of its modern life, while the family gathered at Balmoral in Scotland to ride out the storm, a fresh batch of photographs surfaced. They did not merely embarrass the crown, they finished a job. August 1992. A Frenchman with a long lens crouches near a villa in the south of France, in Street Tropez, photographing the Duchess of York on holiday. Sarah holidays without her husband. Beside her sits her financial advisor, a Texan named John Bryan, and the two keep no distance at all. The photos run everywhere. In the most infamous, Bryan bends over Sarah's bare foot and kisses her toes, sucks them, depending on which paper you read and how badly that paper wanted a sale. Fleet Street practically combusts. The story earns a name within hours, the kind that trails a person to the grave. Toegate. John Bryan, Sarah's self-styled financial advisor, ran in the same circle as the very Steve Wyatt, whose photos sank the marriage months earlier. Andrew, off serving with the Navy, learned about the sun lounger pictures the way the rest of the country did, from the newsstand. By then, the formal separation already stood on paper, yet the timing wrecked any lingering hope of a quiet reconciliation. Within the family, the episode confirmed a verdict that no longer needed confirming. Sarah, the bright spark who once thawed the coldest house in Britain, now fed the same tabloid machine then devouring Charles and Diana. Now picture the scene at Balmoral. The entire royal family sits under one roof, and the newspapers arrive every morning, as always. And there, splashed across the breakfast table for the Queen, Prince Charles, Princess Anne, and Prince Philip to digest over their eggs, lies the mother of two young princesses, her toes worshipped by her money man on a French sun lounger. A wildly popular version of that breakfast room circulates to this day. Philip storms in, flings the newspaper down, walks out in furious silence. Maybe the Queen read it first. Maybe Sarah walked in mid-scandal. Perhaps an icy glare replaced the thrown paper. And here comes the honest part. Nobody actually in that room ever confirmed a word of it on the record. The breakfast room blow-up belongs to royal folklore, retold so often it calcified into fact. I cannot tell you it happened, because the people who could are gone and their stories never matched. What I can tell you about the photographs needs no dressing up. Whatever fondness Philip held for the redhead who loved carriage driving evaporated that August. The timing alone struck him as unforgivable. The institution knelt, bleeding from the Morton book, and his daughter-in-law chose that exact window to land topless in the papers with another man kissing her feet for the entire planet to gawk at. To a man who measured every human being by what they did for the dignity of the crown, Sarah committed no mere mistake. She committed something close to treason against the family business. Andrew and Sarah separated back in March of that year. The toe photos flipped a private failing into a global circus. From that summer on, Philip began doing the thing he would go on doing, without exception or softening, for the next 29 years of his life. He stopped seeing her. Quietly, permanently, on purpose. People expected fireworks from Philip. They pictured the famously sharp-tongued Duke unloading on her in person, firing off one of those brutal Edinburgh one-liners he kept ready for fools, waging some kind of open war. He chose none of it, and what he chose instead chilled the room far more. He simply erased her from his world. The divorce between Andrew and Sarah, finalized in May 1996 on remarkably generous terms, and the two of them stayed, against all reason and most royal precedent, the best of friends. They kept living near each other and raised their daughters as a team. Andrew, by every account, never stopped loving her, and plenty of people expected the two to remarry one day. Inside that strange, friendly post-divorce arrangement, almost everyone in the family found a way to keep dealing with Fergie. Except one man. Philip imposed a rule and held to it with the discipline of the naval officer he trained as. He would not occupy the same room as Sarah Ferguson. Not for dinners, not for parties, not for the casual family gatherings that crowd a royal calendar. If she came, he left. If he stayed, she stayed away. No shouting match triggered it, no single confrontation sealed it. A door closed, and stayed closed. The contrast with his wife sharpened the freeze. Queen Elizabeth, free to follow her husband's lead and cut Sarah off entirely, did the reverse. She kept inviting her former daughter-in-law for tea, stayed fond of her, held Sarah inside the wider family orbit, scandals and all. None of this showed the family closing ranks against an outsider. It came down to one man drawing one private line, while the most powerful woman in the entire country carried right on pouring her cups of Earl Grey. Years later, Philip's friend and biographer, Giles Brandreth, sat down with him and asked in effect, why? Why the total avoidance? Why never patch it up? Philip answered so flatly, and so finally that the reply lays his whole mind bare. He did not see Sarah, he explained, because he saw no point, no rage in it, no grief, no score to settle, just a man who quietly judged a person not worth his time and felt no urge to dress it up. Brandreth came away certain that Philip filed her conduct, in the old phrase, beyond the pale, and would never revisit the verdict for the rest of his days. The granddaughters always found the door open. Their mother never would. Silence did Philip's work for him. He lived by the creed the royals wear like armour, never complain, never explain, and against Sarah he wielded it to the hilt. No rebuke reached the press. No briefing leaked against her. Denying her, his presence formed the whole of it, and in a family where presence equals approval, that withdrawal landed harder than any insult. Other relatives might rage and reconcile within a season. Philip neither raged nor reconciled. He closed an account and refused, for the rest of his life, to reopen it. What makes the freeze stranger still? How much that family forgave in everyone else. This household weathered affairs, divorces, public separations, scandal after scandal, and mostly swallowed it all and carried on. Charles and Diana imploded across the front pages. Anne divorced and remarried. Margaret's romances filled decades of headlines, and the palace quietly blocked Townsend, the man she loved, rather than freezing out Margaret herself. The family bent, adapted, kept its offending members inside the tent. Sarah alone drew the tent flap, zipped shut behind her, a guard posted to stop her wandering back. Whatever she came to represent in Philip's mind, it crossed a line the others, for all their wreckage, never quite reached. Here, the freeze stopped being a feeling and turned into pure logistics, one of the strangest arrangements in modern royal life. In 2008, Sarah moved into Royal Lodge, a 30-room mansion on the Windsor estate, settling in beside her ex-husband, Prince Andrew, in that unbothered post-divorce. Still, basically, a couple way that defined the two of them. So far, so weird, but fine. Except Philip spent serious time of his own at Windsor. You can already spot the problem. Two people who spent over a decade ensuring their paths never crossed now technically shared the same patch of royal real estate. So the royal staff inherited a job that sounds invented and yet ran entirely real, choreographing the daily movements of an elderly prince and a divorced duchess, so the two never rounded the same corner at the same moment. Picture the practical reality. Somebody tracked where Sarah would be, somebody tracked where Philip would be, and somebody compared the two and adjusted every single day, for years. So a man in his late 80s and the mother of his granddaughters could share an estate the size of a small town without ever once breathing the same air. Royal correspondents who covered the household, Richard Kay of the Daily Mail among them, described exactly this kind of careful, invisible management humming behind the high walls of Windsor. It worked too. Year after year, the system held. 2 human beings, 1 estate, 0 encounters. If you ever wanted proof that the freeze-out formed a fixed, load-bearing part of family life rather than a passing mood, here it sits. Nobody hoped the two would avoid each other. They engineered a machine to guarantee it. Towgate lit the fire. The reason Philip never let the embers cool reached deeper into something that cut against the entire code he organised his life around. Sarah climbed out of the divorce buried in debt, by some accounts more than £4 million deep at the worst of it, the kind of hole no apology or quiet retreat could ever fill. To climb out, she did the unthinkable by the standards of the man in question. She monetized herself, a paid spokesperson for Weight Watchers in America, beaming on television about points and portions for a contract that reportedly ran into 7 figures. Memoirs and children's books followed. She licensed her name, sold interviews, took commercial deals trading, one way or another, on the bare fact of once being royal. To most of us, this spells simple survival, a woman doing what the bills demanded. Bills are bills. Nobody covered her rent. To Philip, it reeked of sacrilege. Understand the man, and you see why it cut so deep. Prince Philip surrendered his naval career, his name, his nationality, his entire independent future, to walk 3 paces behind his wife for 70 years and ask nothing back. He performed more than 20,000 official engagements across his lifetime, unpaid, for an institution he believed in like a religion. Duty, to him, meant you serve the crown and never ever cash in on it. Royalty meant responsibility, not a brand. And here stood Sarah, to his eyes, committing the one act he found genuinely vulgar, turning the magic of the monarchy into a revenue stream. Every Weight Watchers ad, every paid appearance, every chatty American talk show couch confirmed what he already believed. According to Brandreth, this ongoing commercial hustle, even more than the toes, hardened Philip's verdict into permanent stone. Beyond the pale, and she kept proving it. Not the scandal he could never forgive. Scandals roll through that family like the seasons. What he could never forgive, the sense that she seized the thing he devoted his whole life to and stuck a price tag on it. If Philip needed any final gift, wrapped proof that he read her right, May 2010 delivered it. A News of the World reporter, working undercover, posed as a wealthy businessman and maneuvered himself in front of the Duchess of York. On hidden camera, Sarah offered to sell him access to her ex-husband. Prince Andrew then held an official role as a UK trade envoy, opening doors for British business around the world. Caught on tape, Sarah named her price for an introduction, £500,000. She pocketed 27,000 of it as a down payment in cash on film. The footage ran, and it devastated. There sits the Duchess of York on grainy hidden camera video, appearing to auction off the access of a working royal like a used car. She apologised afterward, blamed her finances, blamed a moment of madness, pleaded a terrible place in her life. Maybe every word held true. None of it unwound the tape. The reporter behind the sting, Mazza Mahmood, built a career on exactly this kind of undercover trap, and Sarah walked straight into it. The damage outlasted the headlines. Andrew clung to his trade envoy role only a while longer before stepping aside, and Sarah's name, already radioactive inside the palace, glowed a shade brighter. For a man who spent 18 years arranging his life around the certainty that she spelled trouble, the tape read like a memo he wrote himself. Philip never breathed a public word about it, because Philip never breathed a public word about her. Full stop. You need no quote to read the room, though. For 18 years he warned anyone who would listen, mostly through his actions, that this woman posed a liability to the family, and that his refusal to deal with her sprang from clear sight, not cruelty. The cash for access, Sting handed every courtier at the palace the same grim thought at once. He read it right. He read it right the whole time. Whatever lingering guilt anyone carried about the old man's hard line on Fergie, the hidden camera rinsed it away. The freeze-out stopped looking like a grudge. It looked like judgment. The cost of all this landed hardest, predictably, on Sarah herself, and the rawest example arrived in April 2011 at the wedding of Prince William and Catherine Middleton. The whole world watched that wedding, almost the entire extended family packed into Westminster Abbey to watch the future king marry his Kate. Beatrice and Eugenie, Sarah's own daughters, attended in those endlessly discussed hats. Their mother, the Duchess of York, who married into the family in that same abbey 25 years earlier, received no invitation. She watched it on television, alone, like the rest of the public. Sarah described that day a month later across from Oprah Winfrey, and she hid nothing of how deep it cut. She admitted she felt totally worthless, that the exclusion confirmed every dark thing she believed about herself. Rather than stew at home, she fled the country outright for Thailand. The most photographed family on earth threw the wedding of the decade, and the once beloved Fergie bolted to the far side of the planet to escape the silence of not being asked. Did the snub trace directly to Philip? Nobody can pin it on him alone, and a royal wedding guest list passes through many hands. Yet the exclusion did not float free of context. It happened inside an institution that, for 2 decades, took its cues on Sarah from the man at the very top, a man who left his position crystal clear. The freeze set the temperature for the whole house, and in April 2011 the Duchess of York felt exactly how cold it ran. A quieter casualty runs through all of this. The 2 girls who grew up inside the contradiction. Beatrice and Eugenie remained Philip's granddaughters, full stop, and by every account he loved them plainly and well. He stayed interested in their lives and kept them close. Brandreth pressed the point that the door to Philip stood open for the daughters, no matter how firmly it stayed bolted against their mother. The girls came of age holding 2 truths that refused to fit together. Their grandfather adored them, and their grandfather would not stand in a single room with the woman who gave birth to them. Picture the arithmetic a child runs with that. Every family gathering carried an invisible seating chart. Every event raised the same silent question. Could Mum come, or did Mum stay home so Grandpa would attend? Beatrice and Eugenie threaded a childhood where the warmth of one grandparent and the banishment of one parent sat on the same calendar, side by side, year after year, treated by the adults around them as simply how things ran. That arithmetic explains why a single 2018 wedding photo turned into news at all. No thaw towards Sarah drove it. Philip loved Eugenie enough to tolerate Sarah's presence for the length of time it takes a photographer to say, "Hold still." The granddaughters formed the one bridge sturdy enough to span a gap nothing else could close. Where 2 months of scandal and 26 years of frost raised a wall, a young woman's wedding day pried exactly 1 brick loose, and only for an afternoon. Back to where we started, October 2018, the Green Drawing Room at Windsor, Princess Eugenie's wedding. For one afternoon, the wall came down, not through forgiveness and not through some grand reconciliation behind the scenes, but because a grandfather does for his granddaughter what he refuses everyone else. Eugenie wanted her mother and her grandfather in the same family portrait on her wedding day, and Philip, 97 years old, showed up, stood there, and let it happen. 26 years after Toegate, the 2 of them filled the same photograph again. Do not mistake it for a thaw, because no thaw arrived. A single, contained exception, granted for the sake of a young woman both of them loved, and then the door swung shut again. Philip sent Sarah no dinner invitations. The careful avoidance resumed. What the 2018 portrait actually proves, how absolute the freeze ran from the start. It took a royal wedding, a beloved granddaughter, and a man nearing 100 to engineer a few minutes of coexistence any other family would treat as nothing at all. Prince Philip died on the 9th of April 2021 at Windsor Castle, just 2 months short of the 100th birthday the whole country quietly expected him to reach. The funeral followed on the 17th of April at St George's Chapel. Sarah Ferguson did not attend. On the surface, that reads like the final, perfect, ice-cold punctuation to the whole saga. The man froze her out for 29 unbroken years, and then, even in death, even from inside the coffin, the arrangement still seemed to keep her from saying goodbye. A tidy ending, and the version plenty of people walked away believing. I owe it to you to complicate it, because the honest version runs less cinematic. Philip died in the thick of the COVID-19 pandemic, when Britain still sat under strict limits on how many people could gather, funerals included, royal ones included. The guest list at St George's capped at 30 people full stop. Senior royals only. The Queen famously sat alone in her pew, masked, separated from her own family by the same restrictions. Even Prince Harry flew in alone, his pregnant wife absent on medical advice, while rows of cousins and lifelong friends watched the service from home. Plenty of people who loved Philip dearly stayed away from that chapel for one reason: the law left no room. So no, you cannot honestly twist Sarah's absence from the funeral into one last targeted snub from beyond the grave. 30 seats and a pandemic lockdown account for it, not a vendetta. If anything, the funeral warns about this whole story, how easily a sad, ordinary fact dresses up as one more act of cruelty when the duller explanation holds the truth, which loops straight back to the word stamped across the title. The title's word reads despised, and despised matches what everybody assumes because it delivers the easy, juicy, tabloid-ready emotion. A furious duke, a hurled newspaper, a simmering hatred carried for decades. Great story, mostly false. Hunt for evidence of hot, active hatred and you turn up empty. Philip never attacked Sarah in public, never aired a quote running her down. He never plotted against her, never schemed to ruin her, never aimed the famous Edinburgh tongue in her direction. The dramatic confrontations everyone repeats, the breakfast room paper throwing, the menacing first warning, dissolve the second you check the sourcing. No vendetta, no fireworks. What sat there instead might actually cut deeper. Philip did not despise Sarah Ferguson. He decided she did not matter. He looked at a woman who embarrassed the institution he loved, who then spent years selling pieces of it to stay afloat, who landed on a hidden camera auctioning off her ex-husband, and he reached a cold, surgical, final judgment. This person does not merit my time, and I will arrange my life to spend none of it on her. Then he carried out that judgment with a discipline lasting until his death. No drama, no mess, pure erasure. Hatred, at least, treats you as a worthy opponent. It grants you space in someone's head, a reaction, a foothold under the skin. Philip handed Sarah the opposite and gave her nothing. He never saw her because, in his own flat words, he saw no point. For a woman who walked into that family craving to be liked, who charmed every room she entered, who needed the warmth of belonging the way other people need air, that polite, bottomless indifference may have stung worse than any insult he could have hurled. And here lands the irony that closes the whole thing. The very quality that won Philip over at the start, Sarah's refusal to perform, her loud, unfiltered, money-troubled, headline-grabbing humanity, became the exact quality that lost him forever. He liked her because she refused to play the cardboard royal, and he erased her for that very same reason. She never changed. The price of that, with this particular man, ran to a quarter-century of standing on the same estate, inside the same family, as someone he quietly wrote off as already gone. Years on, Sarah Ferguson outlived the frieze itself. She returned to Royal Lodge openly and held on to the family ties she could keep. The man who erased her, though, never relented while he drew breath. His verdict on her outlasted his marriage, his career, nearly his century of life, fixed in place from that August in 1992 to his final spring. Whatever you choose to call that, despising barely covers it. Discipline like that runs colder. In the spring of 1930, a group of relatives held a woman in her mid-40s down inside a house on the edge of Paris, injected her with morphine and scopolamine, and carried her onto a train bound for a Swiss asylum. She broke no law. A princess by birth and by marriage, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, she also raised a small boy who would one day marry the Queen of England. What could drive a devoted family to sedate one of their own and lock her behind institutional walls for more than 2 years? How did a deaf princess, condemned as insane by some of the most respected doctors in Europe, come to spend her final decades in the grey habit of a nun, honoured by the State of Israel for sheltering a Jewish family from the Gestapo? The answers reach back to a nursery at Windsor Castle and forward to a crypt on the Mount of Olives. Join me to find out. She entered the world on 25 February 1885 in the Tapestry Room at Windsor Castle, and her great-grandmother, the old Queen Victoria, attended the birth in person. The christening gave her the names Victoria, Alice, Elizabeth, Julia Marie of Battenberg. Eldest child of Prince Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse, and by Rhine, she belonged through her mother to the enormous clan that Queen Victoria had scattered across the thrones of Europe. A web of cousins and grandchildren whom the centuries' wars would soon tear apart. Alice arrived at the very top of that world. No one in the Tapestry Room yet suspected that the child would grow up unable to hear a single word spoken in it. Her deafness announced itself slowly. Nothing surfaced at birth, and for a time, no one around the infant sensed anything unusual. By the age of 8 months, both her mother and her paternal grandmother, Princess Julie of Battenberg, noticed that the child spoke late and did not flinch at sudden noises, answering speech only when she could watch the speaker's face. An ear, nose, and throat specialist examined her and delivered the verdict plainly. Congenital deafness, traced to thickened eustachian tubes. To grasp what that diagnosis meant for a child of her rank, picture the age that produced her. Through the 19th century, families treated deafness in a high-born child as an embarrassment, something to manage quietly and out of view, and the standard court response shut the deaf away while expecting little of them. Princess Victoria wanted no part of that thinking. Rather than surrender her daughter to the low expectations of the day, she seized the girl's education herself and refused the path of isolation entirely. The method she chose demanded a great deal. Instead of sign language, she drilled Alice in lip reading and phonetics, training her to read the movements of mouths and to shape the sounds herself, one syllable at a time. Slow, relentless work. It asked enormous discipline of a small child who could not check her own pronunciation by ear. Yet it succeeded to a degree few would have predicted. By her early childhood, Alice could read lips and speak clearly in both English and German, the two tongues that filled her home. French came during her youth, learned the same way, by reading movements and drilling pronunciation until it sat naturally in her mouth. Greek arrived later still. She taught herself to lip-read and speak it fluently after marriage carried her south, mastering a language that shared almost nothing with the German and English of her girlhood. 4 languages, and she could not hear one of them. Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark took Alice as his wife in the autumn of 1903, and the wedding stretched across 2 days in Darmstadt, the German town tied to her mother's family of Hesse and by Rhine. A civil ceremony came first on 6 October. The following day brought 2 religious services, one Lutheran and one Greek Orthodox, a pairing that answered the mingled faiths of the 2 families. At 18, the deaf great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria became a princess of Greece. Over the years that followed, Alice bore 5 children. Her daughters arrived first, and then, on the 10th of June 1921, a son, Philip, the boy who decades later would stand beside the British throne as consort to Queen Elizabeth II. Motherhood set Alice at the centre of a large, scattered family whose fortunes rode on the unstable politics of Greece. Those politics turned violent soon enough. The Greek throne rested on shaky ground throughout Alice's early married life, and in 1922 it gave way. Defeat in the Greco-Turkish War brought down King Constantine I, who abdicated as a revolutionary military junta seized control. In the reckoning that followed, the new rulers arrested and court-martialed Prince Andrew, who escaped execution by the narrowest of margins before the junta settled on banishment instead. The family fled Greece. They settled outside Paris, in the suburb of St. Cloud, in a house lent to them by Princess Marie Bonaparte. The Greek throne had carried away their old life with it. Once the wife of a prince in a reigning house, Alice now kept a household in borrowed rooms in a foreign country, raising her children on the goodwill of relatives. The strain of exile pressed on her in ways no one around her fully registered at the time. A bitter irony ran quietly beneath these years. The deaf girl whom Victorian doctors had expected to withdraw from the world had, through her mother's teaching, become the linguistic and practical anchor of a family in disarray. She ran a household in a fourth language, managed children and servants and finances, and held things together while her husband's country slammed its door. That competence stayed real, which makes what came next harder to explain. Something shifted in Alice during the exile years. In October 1928, it took religious form. She converted to the Greek Orthodox Church, the faith of her husband's country, and what began as ordinary devotion hardened over the following months into something far stronger. Through the winter of 1929 and into 1930, her family watched her slide from piety into a fervour they could not follow. Her claims grew stranger by the week. She told those around her that she received direct messages from God, that her hands carried the power to heal the sick, and that she had entered a marriage, both physical and spiritual, with Jesus Christ. To a family already unsettled by exile, such words landed as alarm rather than revelation. In the ordinary run of daily life, Alice remained an intelligent, capable woman who ran a household in 4 languages, and that steadiness left the change in her all the harder to explain away. Alarmed and frightened, her family turned to the medical establishment. In early January 1930, while Alice stayed in London, 2 eminent physicians examined her. Dr. Thomas Ross, a psychiatrist who built his reputation treating shell-shocked soldiers of the First World War, and Sir Maurice Craig, the doctor responsible for the psychological health of the British royal family, reached the same conclusion. They diagnosed paranoid schizophrenia in what they termed a pre-psychotic state, a condition, by their reading, poised to worsen. The diagnosis pointed the family toward Germany. In early February 1930, Alice entered Kurhaus Schloss Tegel, a psychoanalytic clinic on the outskirts of Berlin, founded and run by Dr. Ernst Simmel. Simmel examined her and confirmed what the London doctors had found, describing her condition as paranoid schizophrenia bound up with religious delusions. She remained under his care in Berlin through March and into April, the weeks passing without the improvement her family wanted. One name hangs over this chapter of Alice's life more than any other, and much of what people say about it is wrong. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, did play a part in her case. While Alice stayed at Schloss Tegel, Simmel wrote to Freud to consult him about her condition, and Freud replied with a theory rooted in the biological psychiatry of his day. He proposed that her religious delusions sprang from sexual frustration and hormonal imbalance, a surplus of libido with nowhere to go. Freud's recommendation reads, "From the vantage of the present, as barbaric, To suppress that supposed libido, he suggested forcing Alice into early menopause by bombarding her ovaries with X-rays. A Berlin gynecologist named Dr. von Schubert carried out exactly this procedure while Alice stayed at the clinic, irradiating her ovaries without her knowledge or her consent. Men who believed they cured her had, in the most literal sense, experimented on her. Yet the popular version of these events, repeated in biographies and dramatized on screen, distorts the record badly. In that telling, Freud himself lays Alice on his couch, examines her in person, and administers the radiation with his own hands. None of it is true. By 1930, Freud had turned 73, gravely ill with the cancer of the jaw that would eventually kill him and largely confined to his home in Vienna. He never met Alice, never examined her, and never treated her directly, and his involvement began and ended with letters to Simmel. A second myth deserves the same correction. The story often told claims that the radiation ruined Alice's body for good and turned her into a permanently broken woman. Medical historians dispute this. Severe and violating as the treatment proved, it did not wreck her health. She lived on into her 80s, active and physically demanding of herself to the end. Her recovery, when it eventually arrived, came gradually and years later, long after these bodily interventions had stopped, which suggests they did not heal her, whatever her doctors believed. When Schloss Tegel produced no change, her family resolved to move her somewhere more secure. Her mother and Prince Andrew arranged the transfer together. The destination sat behind locked doors in Switzerland, and the manner of getting her there returns us to the scene that opened this story. On 2 May 1930, relatives held Alice down, injected her with morphine and scopolamine, and carried her, sedated, across the border against her will. Bellevue Sanatorium at Kreuzlingen, on the Swiss shore of Lake Constance, ran under Dr. Ludwig Binswanger, a psychiatrist known for weaving philosophy into his clinical work. Binswanger, too, judged that she suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. Alice, for her part, agreed with none of it. She insisted on her own sanity, protested her confinement without pause, and tried more than once to escape the grounds. The confinement lasted 2 years and 4 months. That stretch is long for anyone held against her will, longer still for a woman convinced she had done nothing to deserve it. The walls cut her off from her children during years when they most needed a mother, and by the end she had grown estranged from the family who signed her away. When Bellevue finally released her in September 1932, no home waited for her return. The years directly after Bellevue remain the least documented of Alice's life. That silence in the record tells its own story. After her release in September 1932, she spent a short spell at a clinic in Meran, in the town now called Merano, in northern Italy, before vanishing into a quiet, wandering existence that left few traces. She drifted between modest pensions and boarding houses across Central Europe, living cheaply and often under an assumed name, keeping her distance from the royal relatives who had signed her away. Here, slowly and without ceremony, she recovered. No single treatment or dramatic breakthrough explains the turn. Her healing came in its own time, across the middle years of the 1930s, as she rebuilt a self the clinics failed to mend. 6 years separated her release from her return to Greece. When she came back to Athens in 1938, she came back alone, a woman in her early 50s who had survived what few of her rank ever spoke of aloud. Greece in 1938 brought Alice no peace for long. She threw herself into charitable work among the poor of Athens, and for a few years the work lent her days a shape they had lacked since the asylum. Then the war came. In 1941, the Axis powers overran Greece, and the occupation that followed brought famine so severe that people starved in the streets of the capital. Alice stayed. Through the worst of the occupation, she remained in Athens and worked without pause. Soup kitchens for the starving ran under her hand alongside the Swedish and Swiss Red Cross, and she set up shelters for children the war had orphaned, drawing on what remained of her name to pull supplies into a city bled dry. The deaf princess, once carried off in restraints, now moved through occupied territory on her own authority. The act that would define Alice's memory came in the autumn of 1943. After Italy surrendered and German forces took direct control of Athens, the city's Jews faced deportation at the hands of the Gestapo. The danger reached the family of Haimarki Cohen, a Jewish member of the Greek parliament from Trikala who, back in 1913, had sheltered and aided King George I of Greece. Cohen himself had died, but his widow, Rachel, and their children now stood squarely in the path of the deportations. Alice remembered the debt. She took Rachel Cohen and two of her children, Tilde and Michelle, into her own home, hiding them in her third-floor apartment inside the Athens palace of Prince George of Greece. There she kept them, in a city crawling with occupying troops, for more than a year, from September 1943 until October 1944. Discovery would have meant death for the family and, in all likelihood, for Alice herself. The danger never stayed abstract. When SS officers came to search her residence, they nearly found what they hunted for, and Alice's position balanced on a knife edge, since several of her own daughters had married German officers of high rank, a fact that cut both ways under the occupation. Faced with the Gestapo's questions, she reached for the one defense no one could disprove. She played on her deafness, staring blankly and feigning total incomprehension of everything the officers asked, until they abandoned the interrogation and left. The condition that Victorian doctors once treated as a defect had turned into a shield, and 3 people lived because of it. The war ended, yet Alice's turn toward religion did not. In January 1949, she founded a Greek Orthodox order of nursing sisters, the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, dedicated to the poor and the sick. The idea drew on family history. Alice modelled her order on a convent founded years earlier in Russia by her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, a woman she revered as her spiritual guide and whom the Bolsheviks murdered in 1918. The bond between the two women ran deeper than a shared vocation. Both had married into royal houses and then turned from that world toward religious service, and both had known upheaval and loss, though Elizabeth's ended in murder. In founding her sisterhood, Alice picked up the work her aunt had begun and lost. The order opened on the island of Tinos before moving to a permanent home in a poor district on the northern edge of Athens. Alice took the title Mother Superior Alice Elizabeth and put on the plain grey habit and white veil she would wear for the rest of her life. The contrast with the world of her birth could hardly have run sharper. It produced one of the odder images of her later years. In June 1953, she took her place at the coronation of her daughter-in-law, Queen Elizabeth II, in Westminster Abbey, dressed not in her rough working habit, but in a specially cut gown of two-tone grey silk with a matching veil, tailored to echo her nun's dress, while satisfying the strict rules of royal ceremonial attire. A nun in a nun's habit, dressed by a court tailor. The sisterhood itself did not endure. It never drew enough young women to sustain itself, and it lacked the endowment such an order needed to survive, so in time it dissolved. Alice, though, never set aside the vows she had taken. She kept them until she died, a nun without a convent, bound to a calling that outlived the institution she built around it. Politics uprooted Alice one final time. In April 1967, a group of army colonels seized power in Greece, and the coup rendered the country unsafe for the aging princess. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip arranged to bring her out. At 82, she left Athens for the last time, bound for Buckingham Palace. The girl, born in a room at Windsor under Queen Victoria's eye, would close her days inside another royal palace, a guest of her son's wife. She lived quietly in private rooms at the palace for the remainder of her life. On the 5th of December, 1969, Princess Alice died there at the age of 84. For a woman drugged, confined, exiled, estranged, and hunted through an occupied city, she reached an age that outran nearly every prediction once cast about her broken constitution. Her body rested, at first, in the royal crypt at St. George's Chapel back at Windsor, the same castle where her life had begun. Alice had left instructions about her resting place, and they pointed nowhere near Windsor. She wished to lie beside her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, whose own remains lay in Jerusalem. Nearly 2 decades after her death, that wish found its fulfillment. On the 3rd of August, 1988, her body travelled from Windsor to the crypt of the Church of St. Mary Magdalene, a Russian Orthodox church on the Mount of Olives, where the 2 women who had traded royal life for religious service came to rest close to one another at last. Recognition of another kind followed. In the decades after the war, the story of the Cohen family reached a wider public, and in 1993, the Israeli Holocaust Authority at Yad Vashem named Princess Alice Righteous among the nations, an honor reserved for non-Jews who risked themselves to save Jews from the Holocaust. The award came on 11 April 1993, long after she could learn of it. The next year, on 31 October 1994, her son, Prince Philip, and her daughter Sophie, Princess George of Hanover, travelled to Jerusalem and planted a tree in her name, a living marker for a woman most of the world had never heard of. Alice's life resists easy summary. Deaf, in an age with little patience for disability, declared insane by the finest minds of her day, subjected to a treatment no ethics board would permit now, cast out of her family, and written out of the story of the house she married into, she survived on the far side of all of it. For most of the 20th century, she lingered in public memory only as a footnote to her famous son, the eccentric mother in the grey habit glimpsed at the edge of royal photographs. The fuller picture took decades to surface. Here was the woman who lip-read 4 languages, outwitted the Gestapo, and buried herself on a Jerusalem hillside beside the aunt she loved. She amounted to neither a saint nor a victim, but a person shaped at every turn by forces far larger than herself.